Good afternoon, Lord Brailsford.
Good afternoon, Miss Stewart. Now, who do you have for us this afternoon, please?
Thank you. Our final witness today is Mr. Corbett of the National Association of Schoolmasters and the Union of Women Teachers.
Very good. Good afternoon, Mr. Corbett.
Good afternoon.
Right, Miss Stewart will have some witnesses, some questions for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
When you're ready, Miss Stewart, please.
Can you please confirm your full name for us?
Yes, it's Mike Corbett.
And you've provided a witness statement to the inquiry, is that correct?
That's correct.
For the benefit of the transcript, that's reference number WT0444. Now, Mr. Corbett, you are the General Secretary Designate in Scotland for the National Association of Schoolmasters and Union of Women Teachers, or the NASUWT for short. How long have you held that role?
Since October 2021.
And what was your role during the pandemic?
So, well, I would suggest firstly that the pandemic was still very much ongoing in October 2021, so my national official role did cover quite a bit of work still related to the pandemic then. But at the outset, I was a teacher.
A teacher in primary or secondary?
In secondary, a teacher of English.
Thank you. And did you have any national remit or involvement with the union at the outset of the pandemic?
Yes, I was in a senior elected lay role with the union at that point, but was still a full-time teacher as well.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you, in terms of your role with the union, your current role, what that involves in broad terms currently, and how, if at all, that was different or additional in terms of its responsibilities during the pandemic response period.
So the role is, as you touched on at the start, essentially the General Secretary's representative in Scotland, so therefore acting on behalf of all our members in Scotland in any way that might support them. So that could be in discussions with the Cabinet Secretary or discussions and meetings with national bodies such as the Scottish Qualifications Authority, right down to dealing with individual members if they have issues in schools or collective issues such as strike action, etc. So the whole gamut, really.
Thank you. And in terms of the role that you held before your current role, your national role, you mentioned that you were also elected in that period whilst also practising. Can you tell us a little bit about the role you had then?
Yeah, so I was the national executive member for Scotland, and the union prides itself on being lay-led, being led by its teacher members. So that does, have quite an influential aspect in terms of decision making. Not day to day, but certainly month to month. You're involved in national executive meetings, making decisions about, what the union's going to do next. And during the pandemic, there were a lot of important decisions that I still had some involvement in from that national executive member point of view.
Thank you. I want to ask you a little bit about the profile of the membership in Scotland, but first of all, your union, as I've said, is called the National Association of Schoolmasters and Union of Women Teachers, but I understand it's not exclusively for those two categories of worker.
Yeah, I mean, the union, historically that's as a result of a merger between what was two separate unions, the National Association of Schoolmasters and Union of Women Teachers. But we represent, anyone who has a contract to teach, lecture or instruct can be a member of ours. Mm-hmm. So we do have some members in the FE and HE sectors, but they are really very, very small numbers. The vast majority of our membership are in primary and secondary schools in Scotland.
Thank you. That's one thing I wanted to ask you about there in terms of the sectors of education. Are they within early learning, primary, secondary? What about special schools?
Again, small numbers in early learning, small numbers, in special schools. So yes, we do have members there, but the vast majority are in mainstream primary and secondary schools.
Thank you. I want to focus today on the impacts on your members who work within schools, both mainstream schools and special schools. I want to turn first of all to speaking to you about the closure of schools, and while I accept that the schools were never fully closed, I'm talking about the move to online learning that happened in March 2020. At paragraph 18, you set out here that at the outset there were unrealistic expectations of teachers. Can you tell us a bit more about the expectation that was on teachers at that point of the pivot to online learning and why it was unrealistic?
Really, it was about the fact that overnight, we, as and I was a teacher at the time, so we as teachers were expected to still be working, still be providing education for pupils. But in large part, most people had either very little knowledge or certainly only very recent knowledge of a variety of platforms that then began to be used, such as Microsoft Teams, etc., to communicate with your pupils while they were at home. So there was a really steep learning curve in a very short period of time, which in itself was unrealistic, but I think everyone accepted we're in a crisis here, we will do whatever we can to help. But then in that first lockdown period, obviously you had many teachers who had their own families at home, often young families. They had caring responsibilities for elderly relatives, etc., having to go around, get groceries, talk to them through the window, all of that. And that seemed to be forgotten by certainly some school managers, that people had all of these other things to juggle, but they still were being expected to provide education for pupils. So the reality of that was, for a number of our members, was they were doing all the family things during the day, and then in the evenings going on and setting work for pupils, and when that came back in, electronically marking and giving feedback, etc. So yeah, not a 24-hour day, but really stressful, and some of that certainly a result of unrealistic expectations.
Thank you. At that same paragraph, you set out there was a concern at the point of starting online learning as a mode of delivery that relating to GDPR and the possibility that teachers or pupils in a live lesson might be recorded. How was that concern managed?
I would probably want to emphasise that I think that was more of an issue in lockdown 2. Lockdown 1, again, because hardly anyone had used online learning or cameras, etc. before. So although I think there were maybe a handful of schools, small numbers of teachers doing that in lockdown 1, largely it was more about sending things out via a whole gamut of platforms, getting work back in a whole manner of ways, and trying to give feedback on that. But by lockdown 2, people were very familiar by that stage with online platforms, and there was far more online learning. But one of the key concerns was that there was very little guidance given around that, in terms of you as a teacher were on camera, you had no idea if people were recording you, if they were manipulating your image, etc. So there were serious concerns around that, and very little kind of feedback or reassurance given. It was very often well, again, we're in a crisis, just get on with it and do the best you can to help out. But there were concerns there about what might be, about who else might be in the room, etc., because you couldn't see. Well, often you couldn't see because it was a black square, because the pupils didn't have their cameras on. But it was a very odd situation, and there were certainly some members quite anxious about being told to do those live online lessons and not knowing what was happening at the other end.
In terms of that, managing that concern, were the teachers' cameras turned off as the default setting on them, or? It
depended very much on the local authority, the employer, what their advice was. So some were more understanding about that than others, but at the same time, when I was doing online lessons, I knew that I preferred to keep my camera on, because I wanted to encourage the pupils to have their cameras on, because in that way you got a bit more engagement rather than looking at 25 little black squares, which was a bit depressing.
Okay. In terms of the guidance in a wider sense, not just about GDPR, but about the move to online teaching in general, you set it at paragraph 28 that as far as classroom teachers are concerned, Education Scotland was posted missing during the early months of the pandemic, at exactly the time Scotland's teachers were desperate for guidance and online resources. I want to ask you first of all, in relation to guidance, what was it that your members were looking to Education Scotland to provide in terms of guidance?
Well, as I touched on earlier, there was so much that people were trying to get their heads around in terms of just the practicalities of different online systems and communicating with pupils. To then have to, on top of that, devise your own lessons, which would have been very different from what you would have been able to do in the classroom, required more preparation, often required a much wider level of differentiation for pupils of different abilities. To be left to do that on top of everything else was really driving workload through the roof for teachers, and this is lockdown one in particular. And as the national curricular leading education body in Scotland, we really would have been expecting Education Scotland very early in that lockdown to be directing teachers to materials to say, well, you may not necessarily want to use this, but here is a great resource for S2 English or for primary 4 kids, and look, here are all the backup sheets for differentiation, etc. So that kind of thing would have been hugely helpful, but just was not evident at all from that body, and that's what we really would have been expecting to see.
Thank you. In relation to the resources there, clearly what you're describing there is resources for learning and teaching.
Yes.
Would that be to deliver online learning or for hub schools, for example? Or
it would have been both. It would have been both. But as I say, just to offer some help in a situation where many hours were being taken up with other things.
Thank you. Hub schools is something I want to come on to discuss, and the inquiry is aware that there were hub schools in operation for the children of key workers and for vulnerable children. I want to ask you about the staffing and operation of those, but first of all, were you involved at all in teaching within a hub school?
Yes, I mean, we were pleased that that was done on a voluntary basis, but having established that it would be done on a voluntary basis, I felt, particularly as I was in a lead national role on the union side, that I really had to show willing and try and hopefully encourage others to get involved. So yes, I did volunteer to go into the hubs on a number of occasions. Yeah.
Thank you. And in terms of the staffing of the hub schools, was that done on a rota basis, or how was that manned?
Largely so. You'd have a set of volunteers, and then it would typically be done on a rota basis. A head teacher would know how many people they had. They would get them in on a rota basis, and then what you had were small groups, typically, of pupils, as you say, mainly I would say the children of key workers, in health, etc. But you didn't really know from one hub session to the next who you were going to have. You might have had a relationship with some, but not with others. They would be of differing ages, so that was quite a challenge as well, just in terms of what you did to try and engage quite a different group of young people. Although, having said that, I also saw it as being there to reassure them, because many of them were feeling fearful, scared about the situation they were in. So you were aiming, to show them something familiar. They were in a familiar building, and to do things with them that, absolutely were educational, but hopefully engaging, a bit of fun as well, just to try and take their minds off the situation more widely.
Staying just now with the staffing of hub schools, were they staffed by members of staff other than qualified teachers, for example, facility staff or
No, not
assistants?
typically. I mean, if you were going to be in front of pupils, even if that was a very small group of pupils, it would be a teacher who would be doing that. And as I say, we were pleased that a voluntary model was offered, and certainly, as far as we can tell, that voluntary model worked, and there wasn't a situation where a school was struggling to staff a hub at that point.
And in connection with the support staff, the way they would ordinarily be present in a classroom, were they also present in the hub schools?
I think where you would have got support staff involved would be because the hubs were also for vulnerable pupils, so often pupils with additional support needs who maybe needed to come in to get better support that just wasn't possible at home. So I think you would have had some support staff involved in those situations, although I do know that from a bit of research that was done, I think 2022, that there wasn't a huge uptake of that the vulnerable pupils coming in for a couple of reasons. It would seem partly just an understandable fear of the spread of infection, but also there seemed to be sometimes a difficulty in understanding who qualified or did not, what was a vulnerable pupil, and that maybe wasn't always made quite as clear as it could have been.
In terms of the eligibility for hub schools and who did or did not qualify, was that something that was evaluated by the school, or was it done by the local authority on a wider level?
I think local authorities tended to give some broad guidance, and then individual schools would interpret that as best they could.
In terms of the learning and teaching in hubs, you've touched on this a little bit already. You mentioned it would be on a rota basis, so not each day, and you wouldn't necessarily know which pupils you had. What did the learning and teaching in the hub schools look like? For example, would pupils attend a hub school and tune in to a live lesson delivered by a different teacher while having some element of while having supervision within the classroom, or were they taught by the person staffing the hub school?
Yeah, I think largely, there may have been occasional use of online learning, but largely in the hub schools it was a face-to-face situation where you had a teacher in a classroom with a group of pupils. So when I was in it, would maybe be 9 or 10 pupils, and it would be treated, as much as possible a normal lesson. So you would get them to. Well, I'm an English teacher, so you would get them to read a story, respond to that. They'd maybe do a little bit of work together. So as much as possible, you're trying to make it as close as it could be to a normal lesson.
Thank you. I want to turn now to looking at not only hub schools but at reopening of schools more broadly, and I want to ask you about issues relating to the provision of PPE for those working with children who have additional support needs. And you've mentioned in your opening remarks that they are a cohort of your membership. At paragraph 31, you set out that there was a lack of PPE for those who worked closely with children who have significant additional support needs. I want you to tell us a little bit about the role of the teachers who work alongside these children who have needs which you've termed significant.
Yeah, so if you're in a special school, for example, you might need to be involved in intimate care, of a pupil, helping to feed them, for example. But even those who were in a more mainstream setting, additional support needs teachers there still typically are working one-to-one or with very small groups of pupils who often simply don't understand the concept of social distancing, etc., because we did have social distancing for periods of time in schools once we were back in, but it was particularly additional support needs teachers who felt they were in very close contact. Sometimes they were intimately involved with pupils, and they just were not provided with what they felt they should have been. I think they were looking at that point at what eventually was provided in the health sector and thinking, well, should I not be getting an apron or gloves or similar? And occasionally they did, but it really seemed a rare thing for those teachers to get the kind of protective equipment that would have reassured them that they thought they needed.
Thank you. You've mentioned there about providing intimate care. One thing you highlight at that paragraph is about peg feeding. Can you describe to us what that is in terms of the requirement on the member of staff to provide this care?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just one particular example, and I'm not suggesting this happened a huge amount of the time, but you know, it's almost at the level of a medical procedure. You know, the intimacy and involvement of teachers in helping, you know, in this case maybe a particular pupil to feed them with certain equipment, and it just, I think, helps to demonstrate how closely and intimately involved those teachers were with some individual pupils, and why there was that need perhaps for more personal protective equipment.
Thank you. I want to look now with you at the disproportionate impact on certain cohorts of your membership, and one such cohort that you draw attention to in your statement at paragraph 21 is probationer teachers. I wonder if you could explain to us what that term probationer teacher means.
So a probationer teacher is someone who is not yet fully qualified, so they have emerged from university with their teacher training qualification, but in Scotland they then get a guarantee of 1 year's employment in a school, in a local authority, and that year then they still get various observations, etc., and support and mentoring, and ideally at the end of that year then they become fully qualified, and that is seen as a world-leading thing, the teacher induction scheme, as it's called. But a probationer teacher typically is referring to someone in that situation who's in a school for that year, leading to them being fully qualified.
In terms of their requirements for them to obtain that full registration, what are the requirements?
So they have to have a certain number of meetings with their mentor during the year, demonstrate that they're fulfilling the standards for teaching in a variety of ways, but crucially I think they undergo 9 teaching observations during the year, and that's obviously one of the crucial parts that reassures everyone that yes, they're on the right track, and eventually yes, you know, they're good enough for us to sign off that they will be a fully fledged teacher next year.
And from your statement, you say that cohort who would be scheduled for full registration at the close of the term in June of 2020 were able to get full GTCS, which is the regulatory body for teachers, that registration without fulfilling the normal criteria. What was the new criteria, if I can put it that way?
Well, I mean, it was just, as we know, the lockdown happened towards the end of March, so essentially you missed that final term where there would ordinarily have been further observations and the completion by the probationer and signed off by their head teacher, typically of a full report demonstrating what they'd done during the year. So there was no requirement for, you know, those observations. I think the requirement, the normal expectation of the level of reporting was much reduced, and we thought that was at the time the right thing to do for that cohort, because obviously they had no opportunity to finish their year properly. So we thought it was right that they were given the rubber stamping as yes, we think you can go on as a fully qualified teacher next year. I suppose in a different situation we might have, and they might have thought, well, am I quite ready to go into full-time teaching in August 2020? But in August 2020, I think as that was the wider reopening of schools, and those teachers and everyone around them, I think was more concerned about, right, is my workplace safe? You know, do we have hand sanitizer, etc. So I don't think that really arose as a major concern at that point.
And you mentioned earlier in your evidence about the commencement of your current role in October 21 was still very much involved in pandemic response. In terms of the probationers who commenced in August 2020 and would be scheduled to qualify for full registration at the close of that academic year, is it your view or your union's view that these probationers should have been given the same criteria as the year before that?
Well, I think they had a harder time, definitely, and that's the cohort that found it more challenging because the second lockdown happened slap bang in the middle of that academic year, so January to say early to mid-March. So those probationers then missed out largely on that chunk of the academic year where they ordinarily would have been building up their experience, but crucially a certain number of observations. And rather than there being a lot of leeway given to those as there was in the previous year, they were under a lot of pressure to catch up really, and do the same, the requisite number of observations and fill out the report fully, etc. at the end of that year. So they were under a lot more pressure, and certainly we felt that it was a little unfair on them. There certainly didn't appear to be the same leeway shown to them as there had been the previous year, despite the fact that they had also missed a large chunk of the year in school on the premises.
And what was the impact of that on the probationer teachers and on those tasked with supervising them and conducting these observations? An
increased level of workload and concomitant stress, really. I think in the end, as I've touched on earlier, a lot of people thought, well, there is no alternative. This is what I've been faced with. I'll just get my head down and get through it. But they found it very, very hard, and we thought it was a little unfair on them.
The other cohort you mentioned is supply teachers. At paragraph 22, you draw attention to the fact that they were unable to work and had work cancelled and reduced employment opportunities. In relation to hub schools, were they given the opportunity to volunteer?
They would have been, and certainly, if a head teacher, for example, was expecting a couple of teachers in that day in the hub, and perhaps one of them, could have been sick, they could have relied on supply teachers there. But supply teaching opportunities were much reduced. But again, rather like the probationers, I think there was a very different approach taken between lockdown 1 and lockdown 2. So lockdown 1, because some supply teachers had been expecting work that term, and then there was no school to go to for them, arrangements were put in place, led by Scottish Government, so that those supply teachers were paid essentially for work they might have expected to get but then could not do. But that did not apply in lockdown 2. So I think the supply teachers, again, rather like that cohort of probationers in the second year of the pandemic, seemed to be treated less fairly because there were not the same arrangements made in terms of compensating them for the lack of work opportunities.
And is that the supply teacher job retention scheme that you're referring to there?
Well, that was very much in around lockdown 1, where that was mainly set up. But as I say, lockdown 2, it was still very hard for supply teachers, and there wasn't the same level of kind of compensation and support offered to them in that period. And I think that's had an impact. I know we will come eventually to ongoing impacts, but I think potentially there is an ongoing impact there that we, lost a lot of supply teachers who had decided, well, I'm not able to get work or the guarantee of regular work here, and they've gone off and done something else.
The other cohort I wanted to ask you about was guidance or pastoral care staff, and that's just the following paragraph, paragraph 23. You've explained here that these members are often involved in liaising in a cross-sector manner. Can you describe for us the way that these members of staff, these teachers, work with other agencies in terms of delivering education? Yeah, so if you have a pupil who is struggling particularly for any kind of reason, that could be because of an additional support need or behavioural issues or issues in their family background, then quite often what will be set up for that pupil is what's called a team around the child. And that team around the child obviously includes their teacher or teachers in the school, their pastoral or guidance teacher, maybe a member of the senior management, but crucially involves external agencies and others. So very often an educational psychologist and or a social worker, and in cases it might be a speech and language therapist, etc. And one of the biggest challenges for those pastoral and guidance teachers in the 2 lockdowns in particular was that
the access to those, external agencies and other council workers just seemed to largely disappear overnight. And they very much felt abandoned almost and left to do the work of the whole team around the child as best they could themselves.
You mentioned there in that same paragraph that their work was impacted by the availability of staff within other local authority departments. Why was it there was limited staff within other local authority departments for them to liaise with on this?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that maybe local authorities themselves or those workers could answer in more detail. I mean, we can only speculate, and I imagine that certainly in lockdown 1, for example, many of them, again, as I touched on with some teachers, may have had their own families, their own caring responsibilities, etc. So it simply was not possible for them to agree to attend a meeting, even an online meeting at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon to discuss a particular pupil. So understand at least some of the reasons why that might have been the case, but that did not help those on the front line, particularly those pastoral guidance teachers who were having to deal with families themselves then and do the best they could to support those children.
Thank you. And it's not something that you've mentioned in your statement, but it's something we've heard a lot about, and you've brought it up there in terms of the team around the child, involving some of the allied health professionals. To what extent did the redeployment of these members of staff impact the guidance and pastoral care staff?
Sorry, what do you mean by the redeployment of?
The redeployment, for example, of speech and language therapists or of occupational therapists.
Oh, to other roles.
To other roles, yes.
Well, obviously that meant that they weren't available or as available to help out with, the schools and the teachers.
Thank you very much. I want to turn now to looking at the impacts in relation to secondary school teachers who are involved in the delivery of national qualifications, and your witness statement on this topic starts at paragraph 34. You set out here in terms of the alternative certification model and also in relation to the ranking that was done by the teachers. If we can take the ranking first of all, can you tell us a bit about when this was done and what the process was that teachers had to do and what essentially is meant by the ranking? Yeah.
So we went into lockdown 1 in March, and obviously you're leading up to what would normally be examination season and national qualifications being awarded. So clearly those exams were cancelled, they couldn't go ahead, everyone understood and accepted that. And at that stage of the year, all secondary teachers will have had a very good idea and a very good body of evidence in terms of how they think their pupils would have done if they'd been able to sit those exams. So it was perfectly reasonable then to ask those teachers to look at that evidence, to have that cross-checked, but then to essentially estimate, well, if these pupils had sat exams, what would they have got? And that is absolutely the right way to go about things. The problem arose when the SQA, for whatever reason, I still have no idea exactly why they decided to do this, insisted that all of those pupils should be individually ranked. So just to give you an example, if I'm sitting with my higher class of 30, let's say I expected 10 of them to get an A. Well, okay, 10 of them are going to get an A, they're going to get an A. Why then did I need to say which rank them from 1 to 10? And then we had to do that across the whole school for each subject. That's not what they get on their certificate. Yes, the A is divided into an A band 1 and 2, 85% or above, or 70 to 84%. But beyond that, pupils don't get an exact score when they get their exam results. So it seemed utterly bizarre that we had to spend an enormous amount of time separating out all of these pupils into individually ranked places. And I've still no idea why, because if we then take one step further on, what happened, as we know, was the SQA did not accept at face value initially all of those teacher estimates, suggestions of this is what these pupils should get. Their algorithm was then applied, and there was a public scandal because that seemed to ensure that lots of pupils who came from schools and more deprived areas had their grades reduced. And then there was a scandal, and then John Swinney decided, oh, actually, we will rely on the teacher estimates after all. But it seemed a really odd way to go about things. And to this day, I've never had a reasonable explanation of why we had to do all of that additional work, which we wouldn't have done in a normal year.
In terms of the impact on teachers, would that be largely in connection with workload, as you've said there?
Huge unnecessary increase in workload.
And in terms of the impacts on the candidates, the pupils?
Well, we did not, well, I don't think, and certainly in our school, and I think this applied largely, we did not typically let the pupils know what we had put in for them in terms of the grade. So I suppose they did not really, there was not a huge impact on them until the exam results were published, when clearly there was an impact initially, and many of them thought, well, that's not what I hoped I was going to get. But then the wider story came out that, well, it was an algorithm, not what your teacher suggested, and then that decision was largely reversed.
Okay. You've mentioned there that you've no idea why these decisions were made. We heard this morning from a witness speaking on behalf of Unite Scotland, whose members include those who work within SQA in areas of qualification design, for example, and setting grade boundaries. And that witness spoke about the role these members of staff at SQA had in liaising with practising teachers about exam design and so on. Were your members involved in exam design, or in just determining what would happen with assessment in 2020?
Some of those, if they already had an SQA role, may have been involved, because obviously a lot of practising teachers work as markers or assessors or setters, etc. But the thing that vexed us the most is that we, as a union, were not invited to join the National Qualifications Working Group, which was tasked with taking that kind of work forward. And again, that seemed a very strange decision when we, as a UK-wide union, had access to what was happening with qualifications in England and Wales and Northern Ireland. So that seemed a curious decision. So we certainly didn't have a role, and if any of our members did, it may have been in a very small way, because they'd previously done work for the SQA.
Thank you. And in terms of the involvement of your members with the design of the alternative certification model, which is what was in place the following year, was that the same, or was there more involvement in that?
No, I would have said that was exactly the same. Despite protesting that it was not a good idea to exclude us from that group, we were still not invited to join that group the following year. So I had certainly no official opportunity to influence how that alternative certification model would operate.
Thank you. In relation to quality assurance, you say at paragraph 36 that there was a quality assurance juggernaut that the design of the ACM unleashed. Can you first of all describe for us what the usual quality assurance process is around the awarding of final grades for national qualifications?
Well, that would take place at the SQA in the main, but some qualifications have coursework elements that are produced in school. So in those kind of circumstances, if part of the award is based on essentially teacher judgment, obviously the teacher would say mark a piece, mark an essay or similar, but that would then be cross-marked by at least one other peer usually. But and then from time to time you would do work maybe as a department on blindly on essays, and then work together to make sure you're all really applying the same sort of standards. So that's typically how that would work in normal circumstances.
Thank you. And in terms of how this worked during the pandemic, at that same section of your witness statement, you set out that candidates' work and grades were being checked and cross-marked 5 or more times, including by local authority employees who were not teachers. Can you describe for us how the quality assurance process is put in place, and as described there by you, impacted the the teachers involved in it and the
Well,
learners?
again, it seemed to be an unnecessary increase in workload, because as well as what you would normally have, well, I would mark an essay and a peer would have a look at it and say, oh yeah, that's certainly a grade A essay, etc. That process, you would then have a head of department was told they had to have a look as well. And then a member of a senior management team in school was told they had to have a look at that as well. And then on many occasions, someone at the local authority had a look. Now, by that stage, it seemed to simply be they had a look. And to go back to my earlier example of, oh, hang on, there are 10 A's in that class. That's too many. That's not normally how many A's there are. You need to have a look again and reduce the grades that you are estimating, which is, again, very strange, because it doesn't recognise that from one year to the next you have different cohorts of pupils. Some year groups sometimes do better than others the year before, and vice versa. So I've got a feeling that was influenced by the scandal the previous year of, here are teacher estimates, SQA algorithm, oh, there are too many A's, we're not giving as many A's, oh, actually, big scandal, we will give them after all. It almost seemed like, well, we can't trust the teacher judgment again, we have to quash the number of A's or the number of passes. There didn't seem to be any other explanation for that, and it just led to increased workload, but also a lot of very experienced teachers, many of whom had worked for the SQA for years, questioning their own judgment, because it was getting questioned by others, very often outside the school, sometimes who were not teachers themselves. So again, it just seemed an unnecessary, over-the-top approach when you could have trusted what was largely there in the first place and had operated pre-pandemic reasonably well.
Thank you. In terms of the local authority employees, you say that they were not teachers. What role were they fulfilling at the local authority?
Some may have been former teachers. Typically it would be people, for example, in a quality improvement area, so quality improvement managers and officers that you get in local authorities who are there typically to support schools improve the quality of their work in normal times, day to day, year to year, and some are former teachers, some are not, but certainly none of these local authority employees typically had been teachers recently, but they very much seem to be motivated by the idea that these grades were inflated and you need to look at them again because we can't possibly submit this number of A's or this number of passes.
Okay. I want to turn now to asking you about some aspects of communication with the Scottish Government in relation to impacts. First of all, in connection with ventilation, at paragraph 38, you set out that members had stress and anxiety, and this is something you've alluded to in general terms before about the safety of their workplace, but you say here that they had concerns around ventilation and that the NASUWT received numerous inquiries from members on issues including ventilation. Can you tell us what it was about ventilation that members were anxious about?
Well, I think as we progressed through the pandemic, I mean, those early days, I think everyone in their minds thought that it was spread by touch, and so everyone was putting gloves on and changing clothes when they came back from the supermarket, etc. But as we progressed, it became much clearer, even if I don't think the World Health Authorities necessarily came out and said that quickly, but became fairly clear that it was airborne and that ventilation therefore was absolutely vital. And that I think it was simply that teachers are out there, they're watching the news, they're reading newspapers, etc. They're recognising, okay, this is really quite an issue, and I'm in a classroom that feels warm, feels stuffy. That's maybe not the greatest place to be while we still have a virus that is spreading.
And did your union inform the Scottish Government that the issue of ventilation was being raised by members?
Yes, we did, and I have to say that although maybe not as quickly as we wanted, Scottish Government did in August 2021 agree to roll out CO2 monitors to, well, supposedly every teaching and learning space across the country. So we expected that to mean every classroom would have a CO2 monitor, although, as happened in many aspects of the pandemic, that national guidance from government didn't always land in the same way locally. And I think even when they did a review in the October holiday break that year, 2021, of where things were sitting, I think at that stage there were still only about 80% of classrooms that had a CO2 monitor, despite that assurance in August that everyone would. So there was a commitment there eventually from Scottish Government to try and address that, but that didn't always work on the ground without pressure from the likes of ourselves.
Thank you. You mentioned a short while ago that it wasn't done perhaps as quickly as you'd want. That commitment you mentioned was August 21. When was it that these issues were raised by your members first?
I mean, I would say the earlier part of that year, I would say it was 2021 from early on, where members were beginning to raise that more and more as an issue and something they'd like to see addressed.
Thank you. And are you aware of that from the role that you had at that time in early 2021?
Yeah.
Okay. And just finally on this issue, you've alluded to guidance and perhaps different applications of that across local authorities. Do you recall any written information, advice or instruction being given in particular about the issue of ventilation?
Well, we got some eventually that we thought was useful, but that didn't come out until either December 21 or January 22, and it seemed to take a little while to convince COSLA, as it was in this case, to accept that they should be publicly making clear there were certain limits in terms of CO2 monitors at which action should be taken. And again, in terms of our UK role, we actually took on board what had happened in Wales with the Welsh Government, where they, before that time, had said if a CO2 monitor reaches 1,500 parts per million, that's beginning to get to a worrying level. You need to do something about the ventilation in that space you're in, or potentially move to another space for it to be safe and to be, for there to be less spread of the virus. So we did get something eventually with clear advice, but it took longer than we would have liked, I think.
In connection with other impacts that you've described for us so far today already, were they relayed to the Scottish Government at the time that the impacts were felt, for example?
Yes, they would have been, although, again, a quibble, a gripe. We, as a union, were not on the main education recovery group in Scotland with the Scottish Government. So we were involved at, if you like, a level below that. There were workforce issues groups where you would get COSLA representatives and you would get Scottish Government officials, but not necessarily ministers. So again, we were irked by that because, again, we thought, well, we've got a UK perspective here. We know what other governments are doing or not doing, but we were not involved in that. But we did, as you'll have seen from the bundle of evidence, very regularly write to the First Minister, the Deputy First Minister, the Cabinet Secretary for Education about many of these issues, including that.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you now about impacts on learners and the impacts on teachers as a result of those impacts on learners. You mentioned at paragraph 48 matters relating to attainment, mental health and violence, and I want just to take each of these in turn just now. First of all, you mentioned that there's been an impact since the pandemic. You refer to the PISA scores, and you say all of this points to failures by the Scottish Government and other national bodies to properly address the longer term impacts of the pandemic on teachers and learners. So can you describe for us what the impact on attainment has been?
Well, I mean, the PISA scores, I suppose, are a shorthand. You know, sometimes their methods are a little questionable, but you can take those. You could take, you know, the latest set of national qualifications results from earlier this year, which show again a slight drop in attainment. So I don't think there's any doubt that there has been a drop in attainment when you're able to measure it. And I think one of the ongoing frustrations for us is we assume that is a result of the pandemic and much of what happened around it, but we still do not have, despite the fact we've called for it, we still do not have the Scottish Government commissioning independent research into, you know, some of these impacts, and, you know, are they, as we think, the result of the pandemic, and if so, how can we address those? So I think there's a bit of a lack of leadership there from Scottish Government right now in terms of assessing some of these issues that are happening in schools that our members tell us are happening right now, why they are happening, how much the pandemic had an impact, and what we can do. And attainment is certainly one of those. And alongside the announcement in August of this year's exam results, and I know that some media were saying, oh, well, this is terrible, there's been a drop in attainment, but perhaps the following day doing a big story on, oh, the attendance rates in schools are much lower, and not making, to me, the obvious connection, well, if attendance rates are lower and some kids are not in school, then clearly that is going to impact negatively on their education and ultimately on their attainment in national qualifications.
Thank you. And in terms of the ongoing impacts, it's not in your statement, but you mentioned there about attendance rates. Is that also an ongoing impact that your members are making you aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt that, you know, school attendance is significantly lower than it was. Now, we're not talking about catastrophically reduced figures, but there are, you know, certainly some children who are, well, there are more school refusers, there are more examples of pupils who are not attending much of the time. And we also have this relatively new phenomenon in secondary schools where pupils are turning up at school and being registered and then choosing to only go to one or two classes that day, and then milling around the school grounds for the rest of the day, not attending other classes. So that, I think, is all bound up with attendance, lower rates of attendance, and we think undoubtedly an impact on attainment.
Thank you. And in connection with that reduced attendance and different forms of reducing attendance, that they're attending school but not attending all classes, is that attributable to the pandemic response?
We think so. We think so. Certainly what our members say suggests that. And it's almost as if for some pupils and for some families, the pandemic has produced a kind of breakdown in respect for schools and for education more generally. I mean, I think we would have said, I know that the Prime Minister mentioned this last week, the week before, that a lack of respect for teachers is an issue, and absolutely it is. But I think we would say a diminishing respect for individual teachers was probably noticeable pre-pandemic and has carried on, but a lack of respect for almost education or the role of schools is a much newer and more worrying thing, and certainly seems to be something that is there now for some families and for some pupils.
And what was it in particular about the pandemic response that you think led to that? I think once pupils are told, well, you don't need to go to school today, so it's the lockdowns essentially, and you know, all that related to that, you know, makes a suggestion, oh, education in schools maybe not as important as you thought it was. I mean, examples of me doing an online lesson and 23 of 30 pupils being there, so 7 didn't turn up, but because of the massive amount of other work we had to do at the time, that maybe wasn't being
chased up as much as it would have been in other times. It's maybe engendering maybe education isn't that important. But I do think what I would absolutely want to make clear is that does not for a moment suggest that the lockdowns were unnecessary, because I know that's a line that some people take. For us, the lockdowns, both of them, were absolutely necessary, and if we had not had lockdowns, then the virus would have spread far more, and there would have been more deaths and long-term illness, without a doubt. But much of the impacts we're seeing now can certainly be laid at the door, in part at least, of the two lockdowns, I think.
Thank you. One other ongoing impact you mentioned at that same section is an increase in mental health issues for pupils. Is that something you want to expand on for us just now?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that, I mean, you have more and more pupils who are school refusers, as I said, and some of that suggests a mental health impact. Those who do attend, there is yet more support needed, I think, with each passing year, but including post-pandemic, you have national figures that suggest there are more pupils with an additional support need, and some of that will be simply more who need individual mental health support. And again, we suspect partly because of how they've coped or not coped very well with lockdowns, or with compulsory mask wearing, or all the myriad of other things that were very unusual and sometimes challenging that they had to face.
Okay. And the other one that you mentioned is increasing violence. Again, can you explain to us, is that something your members are making you aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I would say there was evidence that violent and abusive behaviour in schools was a significant issue pre-pandemic, but our members are certainly telling us that has gotten much worse post-pandemic. And again, maybe bound up with what I was suggesting earlier about not just a lack of respect for individual teachers, just a lack of respect for the value of education, of going to school, etc. But there certainly are more recorded incidents of violence and abuse, and that obviously eventually did lead to the Cabinet Secretary for Education taking a national approach to try and address that. And we've had, in August this year, the publication of the National Action Plan on Relationships and Behaviour, which is a first step in hopefully trying to address that. But again, no doubt in the minds of our members that things are worse in that sphere, and that the pandemic has had a negative impact in that way.
Thank you. You say at paragraph 49, and this takes me just to my closing question, you express there the need to ensure the education system recovers from the pandemic and remains resilient for the future. And just thinking to those ongoing impacts, I want to ask you if there are any key lessons the NASUWT considers should be applied to ensure these impacts arising from the pandemic are addressed and mitigated.
I think in terms of, if we're looking at lessons learned, there are some lessons to be learned from how things were approached during, early on and during the height of the pandemic, in terms of some government decision making and some national bodies decision making. But all of that is laid out, if not in my statement, then certainly in the body of evidence that we've submitted. But in terms of what, those, for us, very significant ongoing impacts that are there right now, what troubles me, I think, the most at the moment is that the language of education recovery, which was very prominent from Scottish Government and other national bodies in 2021 into maybe, into 2022, has now largely disappeared. And there seems to be a sense on the part of many that we are somehow back to normal. And we would say we are absolutely not back to normal. Many things are now settled and are being done in a similar way to what they were pre-pandemic, but these elements that I've shared about attendance, mental health issues, behaviour, mental health issues in pupils, but also in teachers, are worse and need to be addressed. And just to give you one example to illustrate that, in 2021 and into 2022, the Scottish Government funded some programmes to try and help with teacher mental health, so run by Bernardo's and placed to be very small scale, so open to very few people. The feedback on those was hugely positive, and our ask of government at that stage was, well, you need to put more money in and expand these programmes. They're doing tremendous work, and there's similar work going on with pupils as well, but relatively small scale. Virtually all of those projects have no funding now. So for us, we're going completely in the wrong direction. Rather than talking about education recovery, recognising that there are still some significant things that need to be addressed, we're going in the opposite direction. And it's evidenced by some of the arguments we have at the moment, where the Scottish Government committed 3,500 additional teachers across this parliamentary term, partly to address some of these things, to allow more one-to-one and small group work with pupils, perhaps with mental health issues, for example, or behavioural issues. Rather than that, right now, we are in arguments with some councils because they're trying to cut teacher numbers rather than increase them. So that absolutely is a fundamental concern for us at the moment, is that language of education recovery seems to have disappeared. The funding that we hoped for or expected or was promised, it does not seem to be there, and that really needs to be addressed, or else, you know, we are storing up further problems for the future.
Thank you. In relation to the impacts you've expressed there, and just sticking with the lessons to be learnt, can you describe for us, perhaps it seems obvious to you as having been a practitioner and being involved with education, but the impacts on the pupils will, I presume, inevitably impact on the teachers at some point. Can you describe for us the impact it's had on teachers, that there is difficulties with attainment and with attendance, with mental health, with violence?
I think most teachers will almost take it personally. So if they're teaching a class and those children this year are not doing as well as that group last year, although I did say earlier there can be a fluctuation from year to year, but if, you know, consistently for a couple of years now you've had that sense that, well, these pupils are not doing as well, some of these pupils are not attending as much as they used to, for many teachers they will just take that personally and think, well, this is somehow my fault, I need to do things better. And that's admirable, but I think that, you know, they need to realise, and I think government and other national bodies need to make clear that no, it's not you, it's because of, you know, the results of the pandemic, and we understand that more needs to be done, and we're here to offer that additional help and support to try and get us back on a more even keel.
Thank you very much. And in relation to mental health and violence, I suppose perhaps being the principal one there, directed towards teachers as you've set out, what impact does that have on your members?
Well, it's traumatic, and for some it means that they simply don't want to teach anymore. So we do an annual survey asking all sorts of questions, but this year's survey, one of the key questions we always ask is, have you seriously considered quitting the profession entirely in the last 12 months? And 2/3 of our members who responded to that survey said that they had. Now that won't only be to do with incidents of violence and abuse, it may be increased workload, etc. But that is absolutely a key strand that is the kind of thing that makes many experienced teachers think, I can't do this anymore, I'm going to quit, which again, in current circumstances when we are hoping to have more teachers there to help pupils, is a major worry.
Thank you. And just finally, in relation to key lessons, just on that issue of the impact on teachers, is there anything you want to add there about lessons that should be learnt to try and mitigate the impacts on the teachers?
I think it's that key one of trust. I think too often during the pandemic, and the prize example being the one all around national qualifications, but there were various lesser examples, was teachers feeling they simply weren't trusted. And if you want to be Keir Starmer, for example, I know he's the Prime Minister, and it's education in England that he's maybe responsible for, but if you want to recover or increase respect for teachers, then you absolutely have to demonstrate that you have trust in them, and publicly demonstrate that you have trust in them. And alongside that, if they tell you that they feel anxious about the health and safety in their workplace, is to take that seriously and to address that.
Thank you very much. I don't have any further questions for you, Mr. Corbett. My Lord, no further questions unless your Lordship has anything to ask or to add.
No, thank you, Ms. Stewart, and I've got nothing to add or ask. Thank you, Ms. Corbett. Mr. Corbett. That's all. We'll finish there for this week, and we'll return again on Monday at 11 o'clock. Thank you all.